For me, environmental justice is about addressing intentional policies that lead to disproportionate environmental burdens or exposures to pollution. And climate justice really is about aligning climate action with economic fairness.
We've been working on an episode about environmental justice and climate justice for a long time, but wanted to wait for the perfect guest. We found him. This is Plugging In. I'm Barry Wygel. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
Joining us on this episode is Eric Walker. Eric is the Energy Justice Senior Policy Manager at WEACT for Environmental Justice. Eric is also the co-founder of Push Buffalo. Eric, thanks for taking the time and joining us today.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks for having me here. Great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in the work that you do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, at least for me. I think of myself as an accidental environmentalist. I started a nonprofit advocacy organization and community development and advocacy organization in Buffalo, where I live now. And part of what we learned early on in those days of neighborhood canvassing, kitchen table one-on-ones and the like, was that people's housing quality, which we were working to improve, was directly related to their energy bills. And people were really fired up about that connection between housing quality and energy affordability. And that led us to doing some energy efficiency campaign work, ultimately led us into being a key partner in the development and passage of the Green Jobs, Green New York Act of 2010. And that's how I got in the game. And so it's really from like that grassroots perspective that I came to the energy space and, really centered in energy affordability, energy efficiency, community development, and job creation as a sort of virtuous cycle that could be built through what communities were experiencing on the ground.
And what is the definition of environmental justice, climate justice? Are they the same? And kind of lay the groundwork there for me.
Great question, Barry, because I think those terms are sometimes used interchangeably and they're definitely related. For me, environmental justice is about addressing intentional policies that lead to disproportionate environmental burdens or exposures to pollution. And climate justice really is about aligning climate action with economic fairness, right? So that means for me correcting the kinds of market failures that have traditionally ignored environmental justice communities, whether it's the location of peaker plants around the state or some other social inequity related to the energy system. It's about ensuring who benefits from how we move forward. So making investments in clean energy and investments in climate resilience, coastal resilience, for example, should prioritize addressing legacy harms like peaker plants or like coastal erosion. And it's about rebalancing who pays. For a long time, we've externalized the cost of our fossil fuel economy, and that has shown up in all the harms that we've experienced, whether it's outdoor air pollution and exposure to NOx, right? That leads to upper respiratory illnesses and thousands of premature deaths in New York City alone. So that means, instituting policies like cap and invest to make sure that the rebalancing of who pays for our transition and our political economy is borne by folks across the spectrum. In the 40 years, 50 years now, going on 50 years now, we determined that the number one indicator of where pollution sites were located was through race, not economy, not geography, right? Race was the number one indicator of where these big polluting facilities were located across the country. And so policies like that, also the history of redlining, which is both a political and an economic policy, create discriminatory outcomes for people's housing, but also for how they're exposed to toxins like wastewater treatment facilities or other polluting facilities. And so climate justice becomes really about aligning climate action with economic fairness to drive better outcomes, both in our economic activity, but along the lines of social, racial, and economic justice.
And how did we get here? How did New York get to the place where we need environmental justice?
That is a how much time you work
in 2 minutes, please.
We have a long kind of history of two sides of a coin, right? In New York, we have both been a champion of civil rights and democracy, and we've also allowed for really bad things to happen on our watch in the state in the name of economic development and growth. And so we have lots of incidents, whether it's the dumping that's happened in Black and brown neighborhoods. Again, I mentioned redlining as a very clear, intentional federal policy that was picked up and practiced across the state by major banks. As far, still ongoing redlining cases in the 21st century between Evans Bank and others that have a continued legacy of that practice, driving racialized outcomes in our economy, economically discriminatory practices in our economy. And so when it comes to our fossil fuel infrastructure, we have a very similar sort of pattern where things like gas-fired supplemental generation, also known as peaker plants, are located primarily in low-income and communities of color across the state. And that is creating undue harm in those communities that are, for the sake of maintaining the reliability of the system and for economic growth, exposing those communities to lots of undue pollution. So we have this long history of really doing great things while we're doing sort of really bad things in the name of growth.
This still continues today?
Today. So you can look at the peaker plants, for example, that I just mentioned right now, where some of them were set to retire, but then retirement was pushed back to support the system reliability, like making sure we could keep the lights on while we have the opportunity to, instead of keeping those fossil fuel generators open, like really rapidly accelerating the deployment of distributed solar, battery storage, and other kinds of generation resources to support the transition away from those fossil fuels and alleviate that burden. Despite the narrative around intermittency, we still have a huge opportunity to balance our baseload supply with zero emissions technologies and integrating, high penetration renewables.
And what does this end up leading to? There are negative health outcomes associated with living near a peaker plant. So it's not just an annoyance.
Yeah, no, it's not just an annoyance. These are real life outcomes. And so there is a Harvard study that attributes over 3,000 premature deaths annually in New York City to PM 2.5 exposure. WEACT for Environmental Justice worked and co-led a study to identify the indoor air quality contaminants related to fossil fuel cooking equipment. And so we did a controlled study with research partners that sort of looked at what happens when you take out that fossil fuel cooking equipment, replace it with induction stove equipment, and it brought down indoor NOx and PM 2.5 down by 34%, and clearly alleviating some upper respiratory illnesses that were being triggered by long-term exposure to those things. So this is real life. These are literally people's quality of life on a day-to-day basis, but also thousands of deaths that are preventable if we make the switch.
And is this just a New York City problem?
No, I mean, I work for an organization that's based in New York City, but as I noted, I live in Buffalo, which is quite frankly the opposite end of the state.
Right.
Hundreds of miles away. And this is not exclusive to New York City, right? So we have an indoor air quality and an outdoor air quality problem that is disproportionately impacting low-income and communities of color all over the state. And the transition of our economy, as the CLCPA kind of outlines, is one humongous way to drive huge gains in population health along those lines.
Right. You mentioned the CLCPA. So that's, New York's guiding document right now of the energy transition. How did that either impact, hopefully positively, the environmental justice movement?
Well, it's hard to overstate the impact of the CLCPA in terms of creating a really unified front for the environmental energy and climate movement. In 2019, it was obviously clear that, when the state needed to stand up in the face of the first Trump administration, we were already making significant gains in terms of our energy, economic, and environmental policies in the early 2000s, codifying some renewable energy development goals, some energy efficiency goals, and ultimately that turned into what now became the CLCPA, which added this climate equity goal of delivering no less than 35% with a goal of 40% of the benefits and investments within the CLCPA to what are now called disadvantaged communities. So that climate equity, codifying climate equity within the law is something that it's really hard to overstate the value of there. And so not only was it a rallying point for multiple intersections of the movement, it was really a way of codifying some shared goals around making sure we address those legacy, disproportionate, and in the future created fair economic outcomes for those same communities.
And have we started to see any benefits from that?
Well, I think it's a little hard to say because we don't have a clear definition of what investments or benefits are under the CLCPA. And so there are things we'd like to see, right? Reducing emissions, obviously, which has been challenging in the intervening years since the law was passed for reasons we can get into. The second thing is making sure we're reducing barriers in accessing technologies that would benefit folks, like induction stoves that I mentioned before, or just essentially energy efficiency, which is one of the clearest ways that people can lower their bills cheaply and durably for the long term. And then obviously the sort of economic benefits like workforce opportunities in the clean energy sector, whether that be in energy efficiency, building operations and maintenance, or in the renewable sector. I think those are some of the things we'd like to see, but it's been a hard road to hoe over the last 6 years for various reasons.
So tell me a little bit about WEACT.
Well, WEACT is a great organization. For those of folks who don't know, WEACT is a storied national organization that's about 37 years old, pushing 40. It's got about 1,000 members that are based in West Upper Manhattan and Harlem. And so Washington Heights and Inwood. And so the organization started fighting, disproportionate impacts from a wastewater treatment facility, and then has grown into a really national organization that fights both environmental justice at the local level, or everything from transportation equity to pollution equity, toxics in beauty products and menstrual products that are disproportionately targeting low income and people of color, to federal policies like maintenance of NEPA standards and National Environmental Protection Act standards and other high impact environmental quality issues related to energy infrastructure or healthy housing. And so we also run this national platform called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum that hosts 40 organizations across 22 states to work on shared issues along that same line, whether it's fighting for clean energy, whether it's fighting for the maintenance of environmental standards and siting facilities, energy producing or generating facilities and the like.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned it's been, a long road, a tough road getting the CLCPA implemented. Passing it was the first step, and now we have to get it implemented. So how is New York doing?
Well, New York is having a hard time, and lots of factors, right? Economic factors. We've been, as you know, in the middle of still recovering from the pandemic. Supply chains are still out of whack. And so some of the renewable energy development has hit a big bump in the road. But I think the governor and NYSERDA, as the major state energy research and development authority, have committed to trying to continue to plug away at that goal of getting renewables online. We've seen South Fork come online, and we're looking at offshore wind. We're still looking really hard at distributed solar as a major win for getting renewables online in pursuit of the CLCPA. But we're actually in what I think in the middle of a tale of two narratives, right? While we have all those things are laudable, and we have, $1 billion committed from the Sustainable Future program last year, in last year's budget or last session's budget, we have a lot of really alarming actions being taken in the name of affordability. So while we have the governor being named to Time Magazine's 100 climate leaders list, we have some really concerning events happening, right? We have the lack of clear greenhouse gas reduction rules that are now that were due in January 1st of 2024 that still have not been put forward by the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. We have long delayed implementation of the state's cap and invest program. We've got multiple transmission projects being canceled, and we're essentially defunding critical energy efficiency programming for low-income households that are going to fly in the face of the broader affordability narrative coming out of the state houses. And so we think it's really a call to action to lay a clear path for how we're going to continue to meet the goals of this law, which, as of the recent Ulster County Supreme Court ruling, says cannot be ignored, cannot be kicked down the line, and cannot be sort of cherry picked around if and when or how you want to meet the letter of that law. The law is what we need to follow. And so it's a clear call to action for the state to move forward. It's a clear call for us to continue being in the center of what happens next.
When we talk about affordability, you mentioned affordability in terms of energy efficiency, and people can save money on their electric bills there. And then meanwhile, there's other things happening in the name of affordability. How do we rectify that? Because people that advocate for renewables believe that affordability is on their side. Wind and solar is the cheapest way to make power.
Right. And so I think we have a couple of things in play. As you noted, Barry, that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy generation that we have today, both here in the state and globally. And so I think it's not unintentional that there's this narrative being put forward or promulgated or amplified that harkens back to this legacy notion of green is too expensive. So we have to debunk that myth and not just talk about it with data, but we have to lift up real human stories that show that that's the truth. The third thing is that ultimately, like, affordability means something really, really deeply visceral to people. Really, the buildings are where people interface with the energy system most directly, and they interface through their buildings through their bills. So, as I noted before, energy efficiency is the cheapest and most durable way to lower people's bills. And while the conversation should rightly bring in how affordable renewables are, we need to talk about getting energy efficiency into people's buildings to bring down their bills and to make sure that savings lasts and acts to catapult to getting them even cheaper energy supply through things like renewables. So it's a three-legged stool, expanding the story of affordability, debunking misinformation, and then starting the conversation around affordability in energy through the things that matter to people most, which is bringing down their bill.
You had mentioned Cap and Invest, and that's a program we haven't spoken about yet on this podcast. Can you explain what that program is?
So the short version of it is it's a program that's meant to create a cap on the emissions in the state's economy, and then over time lower the cap that would for allowable emissions, and then for any of the emissions within that cap, charge a fee for a metric ton of those emissions. So there's an allowance, there's an allowable cap, there are allowances based on the metric ton. You just do a simple math, a number of allowances based on the metric tons times the price equals how much money we can generate through the sale of those allowances, and that would ultimately come down over time to help meet the emissions reduction goals of the CLCPA.
And it's essentially charging the polluters, and then where would that money go?
So it's essentially, broken into a consumer climate account, which would in part pay for some of the costs of the implementation of that program to consumers. And the rest of it's going to go into an investment account. There hasn't been a clear determination of what those investments are going to look like, but the state has laid out some considerations, some investment categories that it has proposed, some of which include upgrading transmission lines, really upgrading buildings, as I mentioned before. There's a whole pot for addressing kind of community-directed investments and programs. WEACT is really excited about the idea of a pot of money that would go toward community-driven climate resilience and climate adaptation projects, as we have a project called the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan that could really use some resources to support shoring up coastal resiliency, reducing people's exposures to extreme heat and other extreme weather events. And so those are just a couple of examples of where the resources, anywhere from $3 to $12 billion a year, could go to support the transition, the economy-wide transition that's named in the CLCPA and is laid out very clearly in the scoping plan that was adopted at the end of 2022.
ACE New York has worked with WEACT for a very long time, but you recently became a member of ACE New York. Why make that investment?
I think there's a huge value in partnership, and WEACT tries to be a partner with lots of organizations across the state. One thing that's really important to us is deepening the voice of both ACE in terms of their popular grassroots level voice that can represent both the interests of people here on the ground who have felt impacts from the policies that ACE advances. We really do benefit a lot from the incredible technical expertise of the staff, the policy staff, whether it's Deb or it's Jed and the like, that help us inform in our conversations with our members what we think some of those scenarios might look like as we're exploring which policies we want to push forward as a community. And so it really does feel like we're complementing each other's perspectives and complementing each other's expertise, and being part of ACE just felt like a really natural decision to us.
Would certainly agree, and that's excellent. And we're glad to continue that relationship. So as we look ahead to the year, what types of work are you focused on? Especially what types of things can ACE and WEACT work on together?
Well, there's obviously, a ton of things to help advance renewable energy development, right? We have some transmission work that we need to get off the ground. We also have to get through, I think, a really tough set of conversations around where does climate action go in New York, as we're seeing this threat from the federal level really bear down and become something that's not just a rhetorical talking point, but really getting in the way of multiple projects that ACE members are very deeply invested in. And so it's really, to me, thinking about how do we get addressing energy reliability, sustainability, and ultimately deploying more resources into the field to debunk that myth around green is too expensive, and then making sure that as we're deploying technologies, whether it's battery storage along critical parts of the energy infrastructure, or it's more rapidly deploying distributed resources, or scaling up the level of land-based wind and solar that we can do at the utility scale, making sure that we're laying the pathway for those investments to lower people's bills, to drive down emissions, and to ultimately create pathways for that economic benefit that we talked about a little bit earlier. So it's pathways to employment for folks in our neighborhood, but it's also making sure that we see those reductions in our bills.
Absolutely. All right. Lots of work to do. So Eric, I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for joining us.
Barry, thanks again for having me on, and looking forward to 2026.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
Tomorrow we breathe easier. Tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in.